Good evening from Jakarta and good morning for those tuning in from the United States. My name is Jenny and I will be your MC for today's event. Welcome to the third dialogue of Climate Heroes series. This program is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, the largest foreign policy group in the country in Southeast Asia with the support of the United States Embassy in Indonesia and US Department of State. Each month, through this program, FPCI brings a pair of climate heroes from Indonesia and the United States in a virtual dialogue with the Indonesian, even international public. These heroes are prominent figures in policy, academia, think tank, business, and government who are leading the fight against climate crisis and taking steps in transforming their community for a climate resilient future. Today, I am pleased to welcome around 1,500 participants from across Indonesia and also abroad, tuning into our channels not only from this Zoom, but also through our several live streams from YouTube. And we have attendees from around 56 countries, including Indonesia, United States, Pakistan, Philippines, Singapore, Australia, Cameroon, Zimbabwe, Vietnam, Netherlands, Japan, Afghanistan, India, Bulgaria, Turkey, Uganda, and many more. On behalf of FPCI, we would like to thank our university partners, our chapters partners, our community partners, and also to our media partners for supporting this event. In addition, we would also like to thank FPCI chapter UPH as our knowledge partner for this third dialogue of Climate Heroes. Ladies and gentlemen, I know everyone is excited to jump into the discussion, but before then, I will be announcing a few housekeeping rules for everyone in this Zoom to pay attention to. First, make sure to mute your audio when not speaking, and then your camera must be turned on. And please make sure to rename your handle with your institution's name as well. And please maintain decorum in the chat box, and we also encourage cordial discussion and interactions with other attendees. We also provide live interpretation from English to Bahasa Indonesia. If you're joining from Zoom, you can click on the bottom right of your screen for language options. Kami menyediakan penerjemah dari bahasa Inggris ke bahasa Indonesia. Bagi para peserta yang ingin mendengarkan dengan audio bahasa Indonesia, bisa klik interpretation di layar bagian bawah kanan, pilih Indonesia, dan mute original audio. Untuk penonton yang bergabung melalui YouTube, kami menyediakan dua YouTube link pertama untuk siaran bahasa Inggris dan link kedua untuk siaran bahasa Indonesia. Failure to comply with the session rules will result in removal from the Zoom meeting room and you will not be able to re-enter the Zoom. Feel free to join the rest of the session through the YouTube live stream. You can ask questions by submitting it through the chat box and we will deliver it to the speakers. Most importantly, stay tuned until the end of the session to confirm your attendance and receive your e-certificate. So we will distribute attendance form nearing the end of the session. That is all for the housekeeping rules. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in to the rules. Without further ado, now we will begin our session on why the environment and the economy is not a zero-sum game. A very interesting topic with our incredible speakers that are joining us today. We have Professor Dr. Emil Salim from Indonesia, who is Indonesia's first Minister of Environment. During his term, Dr. Salim pursued the coexistence of the environment and economic development by introducing innovative environmental policies, such as the formulation of the National Law for Environmental Management and the creation of the Environment Impact Management Agency. He is the first recipient of the Leader for the Living Planet Award from the World Wildlife Fund. We also have Rachel Kite from the US, who is the first woman to lead America's oldest graduate-only school of international affairs, the Tufts Fletcher School of Diplomacy. And on top of that, as the CEO of SE for All, or Sustainable Energy for All, a public-private platform created by the UN and the World Bank, Kite led the efforts to promote finance clean, reliable, and affordable energy as part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. She was also named as one of the 15 women leading the fight against climate change by Time magazine. Now, our moderator for today's session is Esther Tamara, the Director of Climate Programs in FPCI. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. Hence, I'll give the floor to Esther.
Thank you, Jenny. But before we jump to the conversation, I'd like to welcome FPCI Chairman Dr. Dino Patijala to say a few opening remarks.
Thank you, Esther. I really don't want to cut into Professor Emil and Rachel Kite's time. I just want to welcome everybody. This is an interesting session, especially because it's done after COVID-26, where we have quite milestone achievements, in my view. But the reason why we picked this topic for our session today is because I think not everybody is convinced that if you go green, then that will benefit the economy. I hear so many points or arguments made, even government officials, and sometimes from the corporate friends that say, no, we can't afford to go green. There's too much work, too much transition, resources allocated the other way, and we don't want to take the risks. We just play it safe, right? It's not an urgent thing. And what they don't understand yet is that if you go green, green transition, green economy, green growth, green energy, there are actually more jobs, more capital, more equity, more gender balance, and a lot more benefits will come our way if we make that green transition. And that is really a point that is lost in many economists, in many government officials, and many in the business sector. So let's hear out what Professor Emil Salim has to say and what Dr. Rachel Kite has to say about this very important issue. So let's have a good discussion.
Thank you, Pak Dino. So without further ado, let me jump to the first question. And to contextualize today's discussion, I would like to turn to both of our panelists here, Professor Emil and then Dean Kite. Can you first explain to our audience today why we use the term zero-sum game, and why is this term consistently being used in the public discourse about environment versus the economy? So I'll turn to Professor Emil first, and then Dean Kite. After that, I'll give it to you.
So,
yes, Prof. Emil.
Yes. What is the question now?
The question is, can you explain to our audience why is the term zero-sum game kept being used in the discourse against environment versus economy?
We are now experiencing to walk on a tightrope in which to balance the environment and economy. It is a tightrope because the economy is facing a crisis. First, because we have the COVID. First, the COVID, the normal COVID, and then the Delta COVID, and now emerged the Omicron COVID. So the COVID disease is on our mind, and we have to provide funds, resource for it. Two, the impact of this COVID is on the economy. The economy is deteriorating. Unemployment is increasing. Export is declining. Export-import is declining. And the nation is then dependent upon the government, which may finance the development through debt and increased debt. The point that I want to raise is that we have to walk a tightrope between environment and development in a situation which is not normal, in which we are facing a crisis, a health crisis, which affects then the economic crisis. And the future is not clear yet. The Omicron is now coming up. How long will it last? How much fund should the government allocate for health for this COVID? And then how to sacrifice the economic activity that produce income for years, since the Dutch period. For many years, Indonesia energy is based on coal and oil, fossil fuel. It's not a matter of few years, it's a matter of decades. And the whole system is based on coal and oil, fossil fuel, dirty energy. Suddenly now we are facing the fact that we have to switch to clean energy, and to meet the challenge to reduce the affected climate change, to reduce the impact on the climate change, we must reduce the pollution. And therefore, the government is planning to change an earlier retirement of cost of coal power plants to the magnitude of 3,500 watt in a period that we have to face now, phase out the coal plants in years to come. Also, there's a need for carbon capture storage, which then also requires funds. Third is to create an incentive for the development of renewable energy. And fourth is to promote the reforestation and to prevent deforestation. And then change, and the fifth is change the transportation system away from fossil fuel, away from gasoline, into electricity. These all activities have the goal to reduce the pollution to that we know that Indonesia will be strongly affected by a dirty environment, by the increased carbon dioxide, which affect our island economy, which affect our islands by raising then the water level, the sea level, and change the climate and affecting our agriculture economy. The problem is that all this program of changing earlier retirement of coal, carbon capture, changing the renewable energy and so on, cost money. And that money is very difficult to get now when we are facing a double target, double danger of COVID, to cope with the COVID, to cope with health, as well as to rehabilitate the economy as a consequence of this COVID. So, my dear friend, while we know that we need activities to move to clean energy, to net zero sum emission of greenhouse gas, all this is well known. The clear, real problem is how to mobilize the fund to finance the need for changing the coal-structured energy, to push forward renewable energy, to have that activity, that carbon capture storage, and all these kinds of things that can improve the development with clean, with reduced carbon emission. The facts are that funds for this are not available in plenty terms. And therefore, dear friends, the reality is that we are walking on a tightrope. There is the choice between how to rehabilitate the economy in a difficult situation of COVID, in which the future of COVID is not clear yet. And therefore, the government should provide funds for this. Well, the funds are not available because the economy is declining, export is reducing, and investment is not coming in. Meanwhile, we have to cope also with this carbon dioxide. Again, funds is required and so on. So, dear friends, walking on a tight road between economy and environment is a tough job, especially when you are doing this in a situation where funds are not clear yet, either for COVID, to cope with COVID, or for rehabilitating economy, or to coping with the challenges of the environment of climate change. And therefore, the real question becomes, how can the world face this problem clearly and join all forces to help, to assist, especially the developing countries who are shortage of funds to meet the challenge of climate change? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. A very impassionate answer. So let me turn now to Dean Kite to offer her perspectives as well.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the very kind invitation to be with you all today. And it's great to be able to share the stage with Pak Emil. He's exactly right as he describes the tightrope that we have to walk through. And just to add a little flavour to that, before the COVID pandemic emerged and rolled around the world, we already faced two critical challenges, every country in the world. One was of a deepening inequality within and between economies, which the IMF had described as a corrosive, having a corrosive impact on growth and development. And secondly, the crisis of climate. So the idea there really that we needed to rapidly and deeply decarbonize our economy in a very short period of time, and at the same time protect nature so that nature can protect us. So these twin challenges existed. And then, as Pacamil has described, the COVID crisis has hit us, and we have, as an international community, abjectly failed to date to find a way to support all countries through the dislocation caused by the impact of the pandemic and what that's done to supply chains, capital markets, and to economic activity. So now, going forward, we still have to deeply decarbonize. We have to take care of everybody in the transition to a green, clean growth. And we have to do it while countries are experiencing the pain that many of them are as a result of COVID. So what does this mean? Well, we have many tools that are available to us, and the private financial markets are looking at carbon as a risk, holding carbon as a stranded asset. And so there's less and less likelihood of private investment, domestic or foreign, going into highly carbonized activities, which means that the state is going to have to take care of highly carbonized assets, so state-owned enterprises in manufacturing, in industry, in coal, in oil and gas eventually. And so we have all kinds of new structural problems that we're going to see where countries are going to have to manage those assets in such a way as we are less dependent upon them, but without them causing problems on the balance sheets of countries. So this is called bad asset management. So you're going to start seeing these kinds of conversations. So there's much to say about how this transition can be managed, but just two final thoughts. One is that the international community has not yet mobilized the kinds of funding and technical support for the rapid decarbonization that countries like Indonesia will be going through in order to meet the goals that we all have for climate change. And we started to see at COP26 in Glasgow the beginning of sort of coalitions and ways in which that kind of support could be available to countries to back their plans. We saw an announcement of a support for South Africa, and I think there was a lot of conversations about how to support Indonesia, given A, Indonesia's already ambitious plans, and B, the fact that Indonesia will be the leader of the G20, so we'll be taking on a global leadership role in the coming year. But then secondly, the one thing to remember is that the cost of not doing anything is much, much higher than the cost of moving to a transition towards clean energy, and then from that clean energy running clean transportation. The technologies are becoming available. We have to mobilize the financing. The cost of borrowing has to be at a reasonable level for developing countries. Cost of capital has to be reasonable. These are things we can fix. What makes it difficult is I think that within our economies, we don't value nature. We don't value clean air, clean water properly enough. These are issues that Emil has worked on for decades. And secondly, I think the international institutions upon which we rely for a lot of support, including the Bretton Woods institutions, are not adequately fit for purpose for this crisis. They were built more than 70 years ago for a different kind of reconstruction and development, and they need to be tweaked to be fit for purpose for the kinds of reconstruction and development we need now. So we need more money to back the kinds of ambitious plans that countries have. It has to flow, and it has to flow in such a way that it supports equity and decarbonisation at the time when countries are experiencing dislocation because of COVID.
Thanks, Dinkai, for that answer. I want to turn now to Emil. But how do we balance our economic growth? Obviously, Indonesia has ambitious economic growth, GDP growth targets, and also at the same time funneling these funds from government spending to climate change. How do we do that?
Yeah, so this is exactly my problem. It is easy to say that you need to then save the country, save the environment, and so on and so forth. The question, if you are in charge of the government, of the Ministry of Finance or whatever, are you sure whether the COVID can be controlled by 2020, by 2021, 2022? Suddenly, there is a danger of Omicron. What do you do as a government to prepare funds to meet the uncertain future, the possible rise of this Omicron? That costs money. Then you divert the funds. But on the other hand, you need the funds also to push the renewable energy, to reduce the dirty energy, the coal energy, fossil fuel. But if you have to choose between A and B, and you are the government, well, you don't have the possible tax revenue, you don't have the possibility of an increased export that is also uncertain, what can you do? And therefore, most government will, of course, put the fund to prepare for the uncertain rise of the worsening of COVID, Omicron, and put therefore the importance of the energy in on the second place. If they put the energy on the first place, but then suddenly the Omicron erupt, who is responsible? Again, you as government. And therefore, this is a very difficult period where you walk on a tightrope, in which on the left side is then the possibility of the Omicron, on the right side is then the need to change the energy for the environment. Both efforts are within a situation where funds are not available yet. And therefore, how to assist the government to solve this difficult problem is the challenge that we have to face, not through speeches, not through theoretical approaches, but actual show the government A, B, C, D is possible to choose between the environment and the economy. This is a difficult challenge that we have to face.
Thank you, Pa Emil. Dean Kite, we would like to get your take on this as well. And this goes to the what I think COP26 has shown us. There's a lot of argument saying that developed nations have developed much earlier, and developing nations now still have to face the burden of this health crisis and then their economic growth, so on and so forth. So what is your take on this, Dean Kite?
So it's quite clear that the world is struggling to implement solidarity. The Secretary General of the United Nations has been quite clear that we need solidarity, whether it be in vaccines, whether it be in finance for the green transition, and we haven't found ways to be able to do that. I think to the distress of most of us, right? But what we saw in Glasgow is really, we knew that finance was the key issue for the years running up to Glasgow, and yet in Glasgow we stumbled in terms of the commitments that we need on finance and technical support to countries to make their transitions. So first of all, there is an argument over the supply of public finance, climate finance, from the developed world to the developing world. There was a promise made, a political commitment to $100 billion every year from 2020 on. The developed world missed that commitment. It broke its promise, and it couldn't correct itself in time, and has now committed that money will flow by 2022, perhaps 2023. So that left a bad taste in the mouth of developing countries, quite rightly. First of all, it's not an insignificant amount of money, but it's a very small drop in the ocean of what is required by countries to manage their transitions. But most of those transitions are going to come from domestic financing and from investment. But those public funds are very, very important, especially to least developed countries and small island developing states. Then you have the question of investing in the green future. So the developed world has increasingly withdrawn funding from coal finance in particular, but this is also matched by China and other East Asian nations. And and at the same time is starting to see a withdrawal of public funding for oil and gas. And you saw the first emergence of that in Glasgow. But it's quite clear that while those make bad investment choices in many cases, the equivalent uptick in financing for renewables, for storage, for the kinds of energy infrastructure that will be needed to run off a more renewable mix, that hasn't kept pace. So it's very easy to see the frustration from a developing country's point of view that, okay, I can't get access to finance for brown energy, but because that isn't flowing anymore because it's a bad risk, but where is the money coming for the green energy? So there were signs that this is beginning to happen. We saw a deal for South Africa. We saw other deals going on in the sidelines, but it's not at scale. So this has to be solved. And then thirdly, what's happening in the financial markets and what's happening in private investment. There you're seeing an incredible swing away from investment in companies that are heavily involved in fossil fuels. To companies pledging that financial companies pledging that they too want to be net zero. What this is doing is putting pressure down financial value chains and having a knock-on impact on the ability to get capital. Certainly if you're in the coal value chain, it's very difficult to get capital now, and certainly also for oil and gas and other fossil fuel and heavy industry, unless you can show how you are going to be managing your transition and how are you going to be reaching net zero emissions by mid-century. So there is a tightening of finance available for traditional fossil fuels, but that flow of finance that's interested in green assets is having a problem reaching developing countries. So this has to be fixed. It's not necessarily that there isn't enough money in the system, but the system isn't flowing. And this is top priority for the G7 and G20 in this coming year, which means that the position of Sri Mulyani Indrawati is very important as the finance minister of Indonesia, who will be leading these conversations in the G20. So this is really an opportunity for Indonesia's sophisticated understanding of what transition needs to actually be something that shapes the way that the world responds.
Thank you, Dean Kite. Pak Emil, touching on what Dean Kite already mentioned as well, how can Indonesia better prepare itself to receive all this flow of green investments coming in?
Yeah. Investment is not coming in now. This is the facts of the real facts that we are facing today. Investment is not coming in. Export is not growing. The whole world global economy is such that the development of the country, of the developing country, like Indonesia, is closely to very small, less than what is before the COVID. And the revenue is declining, and the declined revenue must now be prepared, must now be planned to face the uncertainty of the disease of COVID. On the other hand, the need of coping with the climate change, with CO2 reduction and so on. So the country is facing then this dual problem, and what is then most important cannot be decided today, but the intention is there. With Asian Development Bank, Indonesia is now discussing how to cope with the activity to reduce the early retirement of coal power plants. It needs some funds. Guided by the ADB, chaired by the ADB, to collect the funds is not easy today in the period of declining economy. So I was wondering, Europe has been developed after the war because of the Marshall Plan. Without the Marshall Plan, Europe after the war, the World War II, will not be able to be back on its foot again. It needs external financing. It needs finance funds, and there was then this U.S. Marshall Plan. In a way, developing countries of today are in similar position. They have to face the challenge of COVID, the challenge of declining economy, declining export, declining investment, and so on, in a period where they have to cope with how to go to the early retirement of power plant, of coal power plant, how to move to renewable energy, and all this costs money. Is that not possible to have a similar activity like the Marshall Plan by the developed country to assist the developing country to move to the renewable energy? Then we talk business. so that the developing country on the one hand can face how to overcome the crisis of the economy, the COVID, the reduction of unemployment, reduction of export-import because of COVID. How can we cope with that? Meanwhile, we are assisted by funds that is needed to replace the early retirement of coal power plants, to raise the possibility for investment in renewable energy, and so on and so forth. But that through external assistance like the Marshall Plan assist the European economy. Is that not possible as an effort by the developed country to assist developing country like Indonesia, like other countries in Asia and Africa as such? This is in a way, without that, all this talk about climate change and so on is just talking, because developing countries have to face the crisis economy of the world today. And they are doing this in a declining economy. And therefore, the choice is very difficult for this developing country. And foreign assistance is required, like a Marshall Plan in the development of Europe after World War II. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Dinka, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I think so it's clear that the international response to a global vaccination program is far from what is needed. Whether Omicron spurs people into this final understanding that nobody's safe until everybody's safe, I don't know. And the response of the international community over the last 5 to 6 days since we've known about Omicron doesn't seem to show that we're going to respond differently this time than we did 6 months ago, 9 months ago, a year ago. So that this remains a weakness at the heart of the international community. At the same time, you know, the United States arrived in Glasgow in COP26 with empty pockets. So I think did many developed countries in terms of the scale of their financial support and the scale of the creativity that they need to show in order to help countries for whom the cost of capital is too high, access to trade is something that they're concerned about as the developed world or major trading blocs start talking about carbon border adjustments and things like this, to the alignment of the trading system with the need to decarbonize. And so, you know, the domestic politics in the developed world have not embraced the idea that it is actually a sensible and wise thing to do to invest in the vaccine response in developing countries, and that it's a very wise thing to do to help countries decarbonize and build and protect their own nature. Now, we see coalitions of the willing and we see special initiatives coming together, you know, a discussion around building country platforms so that countries like Indonesia would be able to access finance more easily. We saw in Glasgow coalitions around deforestation focused on the Congo Basin. We saw a deal for South Africa to decarbonize from its coal quickly. We saw all of these initiatives, but given the extent of the problem and given the extent of the crisis across the developing world, you know, it was not proportionate. So then we look at where is this funding supposed to come from, and we saw, I think, for the first time ever in climate talks, a very detailed focus on exactly how will the SDR, the new financing arriving at the IMF, how will that be reallocated and how will that actually flow to developing countries on terms which are preferential for them to be able to weather the storm from COVID and to be actually to grow back in a greener and a more climate resilient way. So that these conversations are taking place. I don't think that they are urgent enough. I don't think they're comprehensive enough, but these kinds of conversations are beginning to take place. And it was interesting that at the climate talks, we were actually having conversations about the structure of economic governance globally and the adequacy or inadequacy of rules in the IMF and the multilateral development banks. So not enough, but the beginning of a different conversation.
Thank you for that answer, Dean Kite. Before we take questions from the public, I would like to ask to both Pa Emil and then Dean Kite, what do you want to see coming off COP27 next year in Egypt?
So it's clear that we have to move forward to retire the coal plants, change to renewable energy, and so on and so forth, to move to clean energy. Why? Because the impact of dirty energy will have an effect that affect then the climate change, and the country which will suffer most is not the continent of the United States or Europe. No, the country that suffers the impact of climate change is country island economy, Pacific Islands and Indonesia. So it is in our interest that we can control the climate change to reduce the dirty coal and retired coal. But all this we know, I mean, everybody knows this, how to do this. But to take the retirement of coal power plants, do you know what it means? Coal for years, since the Dutch period, has been the source of energy because we have abundance of coal resource. So the whole system since the Dutch period is based on coal power plants. Suddenly it must be removed and it must be changed into a different thing. That is not easy because it costs money. Second, coal is also an export commodity, and the major buyer is China. And now this must now being reduced. Again, the revenue of export has been declining. So all this means for Indonesia that we have to wipe out all this coal, but it reduce then the earning capacity of the nation, of the country. And what is the substitute of the reduced earning? Zero, not quite clear. Now, but we have to move forward. We have to change this. And we took the decision to change to early retirement of coal to the amount of 3,500 watt of the trillion watt. That has to be removed from the coal sector. Again, money is required, but the commitment is there. For Indonesia, it means reduce export because of coal export, reduce the possibility of a resource that is abundant available because of climate change, and because we know the climate change will affect the island economy like Indonesia, and therefore you have to move forward to a clean energy. But this change takes a lot of money in a situation where the world is uncertain because of the disease of COVID, and now comes this Omicron. And then second, the economy of the global economy is declining in export and import and so on, investment and so. So how can we ask the government, please go on with changing the energy structure, by not telling them how to get the funds? And therefore, my problem now is not a matter of principle. How will Indonesia change the energy structure? Yes. The clear question is how, in terms of real money, funds, in a situation of an uncertain economy of a developing country which sees a declining export, sees a declining and so on, and has to rely on increased debt. And therefore, the question is not easy, I know, but we have to walk this tight rope between environment and economy and move forward. But the how is the main question that I have not find a proper solution, a solvable solution. Talking, we can go on, but a solvable solution, an action plan behind this, a feasible plan, that is missing in the dialogue of the global climate change today.
Let me turn to you now, Dean Kite.
Yeah, well, just to talk about the journey between COP26 and COP27. So at COP26, when you tallied up all of the pledges all the commitments in the national plans of governments, we're not on track for the kind of stabilization of the climate that we need. So we're not on a pathway to 1.5 degrees, which means that many countries will have to come back in Sharm el-Sheikh in November of next year with revised ambition. Some countries still haven't filed nationally determined contributions. Some countries have filed nationally determined contributions which are way off where they need to be. So there is specific work to be done in key countries. Then the pledges are one thing, the plan is one thing, the second is implementation. And I think this is what really you're starting to see now is, these detailed and ferocious conversations in different countries, like Indonesia, like the UK, like the US, across the EU, but across Brazil, South Africa as well. Exactly how does the transition happen, and how is that financed? So we still do things which don't serve us well. So we still subsidize fossil fuels in a harmful way at the cost of $11 million a minute. Around the world, right? So when we know that that is something that we should not be doing, and the G20 agreed more than a decade ago to stop it, and the G7 6 years ago decided to stop it, we still do it. So there's lots of things that we still need to take care of, and then the plan for how to invest in green infrastructure. So what you're starting to see is some creativity, and we'll have to see that really progress quickly. We're starting to see now more carbon markets activity, lots of controversy around voluntary carbon markets and the Article 6 or the carbon markets process that will follow on from COP26. And this will be the year where we have to make sure that any activity within the carbon markets is actually of integrity and credible and transparent. And countries like Indonesia will play a very important role in that. And then we'll also see other creative things going on. For example, you've got a number of global finance houses now working with multilateral development banks to actually pay people to not develop their coal, for example, or not develop fossil fuel assets. So you're going to start to see a new wave of financial innovation. I'm not saying that that's all necessarily going to be enough. I think we find ourselves in a very difficult situation with the real risk of overshooting 1.5 degrees as a target. But I think we should almost think of these COPs not as freestanding events, but really sort of moments of emphasis within what is now a 365 days a year, 24/7 sort of struggle to try to get the global economy onto a fairer and more resilient footing.
Thank you, Dean Kite, for your answer. Now I'll be taking public questions. And first, we have received from Bramanto Wijaya. This is directed to Professor Emil Salim. The new capital city of Indonesia is proposed to be built in the forestry area of East Borneo. And although the government said that they would make the new capital a green city, how do we rational this, and how do we hold them accountable to the project without damaging the environment? And then there's another question directed to Dean Kite. What is the role of great powers like US and China in the international climate change conversation? And this is coming from International Black Sea University, Tato. So I'll let Professor Emil first.
Can you please repeat the first question?
Yes, Professor. So Bramanda Wijaya is asking, what is your take on the government building a new capital city in East Borneo? And although they want to make that a green city, how do we justify the environmental impact of it?
I don't get the...
Can you hear me?
So, what?
Yes. So Bramando Wijaya is asking, the Indonesian government is planning to build a capital city in East Borneo, and they promise to make it green. But how do we rational and how do we justify the environmental impact of that project?
Yeah. So the program is there, but the implementation of this is still a big question because the funds are not quite clear yet. So you must remember that COVID was happening in the year 2020. The government started in 2019 as a continuation of the 2014-2019 5-year plan, and then it moved before the COVID started, so that the assumption behind all the program at that time was no COVID impact because the COVID was not yet coming. But then it erupted in 2020, and that has changed the whole assumption that the government uses in the past, and therefore adjustment must be made. But the government still was thinking that this COVID will be not a long-term problem, it will be short-term problem, so an ad hoc issue. But the situation has changed, 2020, 21, and now moving to 2022. So the assumption is now basically changing, and that has shaken the government to then review all the priorities to put one thing on the long term and so on and so forth. But one thing is clear, that all this requires priority one, COVID, and all this implication of Omicron and so on deserve first priority. Second, rehabilitation of the economy as affected by the COVID needs the second priority. And third is that how to cope with the efforts in which we can participate to reduce the impact of CO2 on the climate change, because the impact of climate change is on the island economy, and our country is an island economy. So if we don't do anything, we are sinking. Our country will be sinking, and therefore climate change and the change in the energy becomes important. But and then comes then the idea of 3,500 trillion watt of changing, of moving the early retirement of the coal power plant, changing to renewable energy and so on. But the money that is needed is piling up. And how can the Minister of Finance solve this problem while debt financing is already used for coping with the country's rehabilitation economy and so on? So all the programs of the past is now being adjusted, restructured, adjusted to the current reality that we are facing now and the uncertainty that we are facing now. Now, this is the crux of the issue that we are of the problems of today. Second
Thank
question.
you. Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Over to you, Dean Kai. The question earlier from okay, you got it. Great.
Well, I think traditionally climate action has moved forward when the United States and China have been able to be in agreement and in sync about how they understand each other's progress. I think it was significant at COP26 that despite the tensions between the United States and China on many other issues, they were able to restate their cooperation on climate action. And while most of that sort of statement didn't have anything very new in it, it was a restatement of what they'd said earlier in the year. They did extend their cooperation into areas of deforestation in sub-Saharan Africa, and also extended their cooperation onto methane, which is I think one of the positive things that came out of COP26 was the focus on ending the methane leakage and working to reduce methane emissions. However, I think what we're emerging into is a world where the United States' own domestic priorities, its own domestic struggles with ambitious climate action represent its political system and its body politic. That China has its own, a different political system in order to manage. I think the Chinese would feel aggrieved after COP26 that they, in actual fact, have large amounts of their implementation plan sort of in place, whereas the US has got the ambition, but as yet its implementation plan is difficult because of the domestic political situation and the continued partisan conflicts over climate action. But we need both countries, and we also need the European Union. So for developing countries, and if we are going to respond at the scale of a Marshall Plan as suggested by Professor Salim, then we need the Chinese Belt and Road to be green. We need the US to come with something of similar ambition. And we need the European Union also to be there with similar ambition. And maybe it's too much to ask for all of them to have the same plan, but their 3 plans need to be consistent and working on terms which are advantageous to the developing countries, so that the developing countries are not expected to indebt themselves even further just to make this green transition. So the dialogue between Brussels, Washington and Beijing is absolutely fundamental, not only in how they behave in third countries, but also how they act as the owners and shareholders of the Bretton Woods institutions.
Thank you for that answer, Dean Kite. You touched a little bit of international diplomacy there, which a lot of our audience today is actually keen to listen about. Next question is probably our last questions because we are running out of time. This comes from Oliver from London School of Public Relations. What do you want to see out of the G20 meeting, especially as Indonesia is going to be the president for the upcoming one? I will go to Professor Emil first, and then I'd like to invite Dean Kite to close.
What do we expect?
Yes, what do you want to see, Professor, from the upcoming G20 as Indonesia is the president for that?
Yeah, so all I think within the government, they are clear that climate change is forthcoming if the, say, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases are not being controlled. And that affects the Indonesia more than other China or United States and so on. It's quite clear that for the Indonesian interest, we are committed to control, to reduce the impact on the climate change, because we, or especially the next generation of 2050, will suffer most of Indonesia. That is clear. But the question, therefore, is the road, the way, how to reduce the negative impact of the energy policy of today in order that the transition will be rather smooth. China, for instance, because of the need for climate change, is reducing the import of coal to China. And what is the consequence? Export of coal of Indonesia to China dropped severely, and therefore reduce the export earnings severely. Of course, from the environment point of view, it's good. But from the Indonesian economy point of view, it's a high cost, because in a stagnant economy, global economy, a reduction of export earning means a lot. So that is the dramatic question that the Indonesian government faces, that on the one hand, it works and it lives in a history of a coal-based power, coal export, coal-based power project, coal development, regional development, and so on. And suddenly it must reverse the course into zero. That change is not easy because it affects the export, it affects the regional economy, and it affects the cost of creating a new energy resource. How to get the funds of the new energy resource? That is another big question. So, in this whole economy, in the whole problem of climate change, the clear question is, how will the developing country that face a transition from a dirty economy, dirty energy, into a clean energy, not of its making, but because of the history of being in a resource economy of coal resource, that change has a cost element that dramatically impact the economy, as well as it put a hole in the need of new energy development costs, investment costs, and so on. And how to get that funds to substitute the reduction of revenue on the one hand, and the funds to change the energy which is now required for our own sake. Now, where can we talk about this? And then, of course, it is to the global world. But the global world always asks, reduce the CO2 emission, A, B, C, and so on. But the how is not being explained. How to get the technology, how to get the funds to do this, how to get for a developing country that face a double crisis of COVID as well as the negative impact of COVID on the domestic economy. Now, a solvable, workable solution is needed. We have to sit down and talk business face to face, the reality, not in ideal terms, but in reality. This is a country which have to spend the resource to COVID and rehabilitating economy in a period of declining economy, in a period where the whole system declined and the world asked for more, that we must spend more on renewable energy. Well, the bill is there, but the fund is not available yet.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be brief because I can see the time. So I think there's a number of things that we should look for. First of all, there was a deal put together for South Africa, which on paper looks very interesting. A presidential commission in South Africa came up with the deep decarbonisation and decommissioning of coal plan, and then that was backed with philanthropic money, but also significant funds from the US, EU, UK. So it's $8.5 billion for the first tranche. Now we have to make sure that that happens, but I think people think that that's replicable country by country. Indonesia would be a country where a similar kind of plan could be put in place. Vietnam, etc. So can the G20 organize a process whereby those kinds of plans come together quickly with new money in order to be able to answer some of the criticism that Professor Salim is articulating? So that's one. Secondly, the G20 is responsible for the voluntary the voluntary disclosure that companies have to make about their exposure to carbon assets, which is called the TCFD. That came out of the G20 and the FSB. I think we're now looking at a world where that has to become mandatory, and you see central banks around the world working on what is the sort of regulatory role for central bank governors and finance ministers in making sure that countries are not going to experience a financial dislocation as we decarbonize. I would think the G20 should put the accelerator onto that work. Thirdly, there is a role for the G20 to make sure that the SDRs that were issued to the IMF are reallocated and then are made available to developing countries at the right terms. And that has to come forward as a priority from this G20. And then fourthly, honestly, I think we need to see that there is a lot of money caught up in the multilateral system, and there's a lot of bilateral money, and it's not being used effectively, and it's not being allocated to priority issues. And so I think we want to see the private sector lending arms of the multilateral development banks originating many more deals in clean energy, clean transportation. We need to see them then taking more risk, and we also need to see them actually then syndicating their deals into sovereign wealth funds and others so that they can then free up more capital to do more. So there's a level of urgency within the multilateral system that hopefully the G20 can do something about by putting its foot down. And then I think the G20 has to start looking at this issue of the fact that in many countries, most of the coal assets and then other fossil fuel assets are residing in state-owned enterprises or financed by state-owned banks, which means as these become less and less attractive and as these become phased out, if not phased down, you don't want the taxpayer to be holding those kinds of bad assets. And so we need to have the G20 lead a process for what are we going to do on a global scale to manage those assets. We know how to do this. This is called transition risk. This is called transition economics. And we've never had to do it on a global scale before, but we have got experience of how to do it. And the G20 is going to have to step up, and the developed countries within the G20 are going to have to put money down.
Well put, Dinkite. Thank you so much. And that wraps it up, our conversation for today, Climate Heroes Dialogue for November. We talked about coal, we talked about funding, we talked about G20 and so many other things. So thank you so much to Professor Emil Salim and then Dean Rachel Kite, who's joining from the early AM in Boston, for joining us today in this dialogue. Unfortunately, we cannot really entertain all of the questions, and I will tell you, so many questions are pouring in from Uganda, from Iraq, from Thailand, Vietnam, and so many others. So for all of our participants today, the Climate Heroes Dialogue continues until the upcoming months. We'll have a next one this December talking about international diplomacy. So please stay tuned for that. And without further ado, I'd like to thank everybody and Professor and Dean as well, and pass it back to our MC to close the conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Esther. Once again, we would like to thank Professor Emil Salim and also Dean Rachel Kite for such a passionate and substantial dialogue, I would say. I believe the participants that are tuning in today have gained new incredible insights from you on the topic. We have been constantly receiving tons of questions from the audience, global audience. Actually, unfortunately, we have limited time. We have been receiving from Bangladesh, Vietnam, Singapore, Georgia, and many more, having been showing their excitement and curiosity on what Professor Emil and Dean Kite had shared to us. Ladies and gentlemen, so that was our third session on Climate Heroes Dialogue about why the environment and the economy is not a zero-sum game. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we would also like to invite you to sign our climate petition as a form of support for climate action, which you can access via the link given by the committee through the chat box. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned to our next Climate Heroes Dialogue, where we will have more inspirational speakers participating. So stay tuned via our website, fpciclimate.org, or you can tune into our Instagram at FPCIndo. Thank you, everyone, and see you on our next Climate Heroes Dialogue.
Yeah.
Saya Mika Tambayong.
Saya Krisdayanti.
Saya Kalista Iskandar.
Saya Reza Radian.
Saya Chico Jericho.
Saya Chelsea Islan.
Saya Cinta Laura Kiel.
Saya Dian Sastrowardoyo.
Saya Wulan Guritno.
Saya Julia Stel.
Saya Yoshi Sudarso.
Saya sangat semangat menyongsong Indonesia Emas
100 tahunnya merdeka pada tahun
2045 nanti.
Kita semua di Indonesia bermimpi dan menginginkan agar bisa mencapai tujuan Indonesia Emas di tahun 2045.
Sungguh suatu capaian sejarah yang indah
dan luar biasa dalam perjalanan bangsa kita.
Nggak kebayang betapa hebatnya Indonesia Emas nanti.
Insya Allah pada tahun 2045 saya akan mulai mewariskan Indonesia kepada putra-putri saya.
Di usia NKRI yang 100 tahun nanti,
saya ingin kita semua hidup dalam Indonesia yang Pancasilais,
yang modern,
maju,
makmur, sejahtera,
hijau, adil, aman,
bebas korupsi,
demokratis, dan tentunya bersatu.
Tujuan tersebut bukan tanpa tantangan.
Ancaman terbesar di tahun 2045 bukanlah pandemi.
Bukan lagi kemiskinan atau kebodohan.
bukan separatisme,
bukan perang nuklir,
bukan invasi militer dari luar.
Ancaman terbesar bangsa Indonesia
di tahun 2045 nanti,
the mother of all problems adalah
pemanasan global,
di mana suhu bumi rata-rata akan naik
3-4 derajat Celcius.
Itu adalah suhu terpanas sepanjang sejarah manusia. Suhu terpanas di bumi kita yang sudah berusia 4,5 miliar tahun.
Suhu tinggi akan membuat planet bumi sakit parah.
Saya tidak mau melihat Indonesia emas dan anak-anak kita nanti
hidup sengsara dalam bumi yang panas ini.
Dengan perubahan cuaca yang ekstrim di mana-mana.
Polusi merajalela dan membunuh puluhan juta orang.
Hujan deras dan banjir di mana-mana.
Gunung es di Antartika terus mencair.
Air laut akan naik setinggi 1 meter.
Sumber air dunia akan berkurang dengan sangat drastis.
Banyak pulau yang akan tenggelam.
Semakin banyak spesies punah, yang disebut the sixth extinction.
Keragaman hayati akan rusak, suhu air laut yang naik, ekosistem laut yang terancam, serta terumbu karang yang banyak mati.
Penyakit semakin banyak menyebar, termasuk malaria.
Stok pangan menurun banyak dan kekeringan di mana-mana.
Banyak tanah yang akan menjadi padang pasir tandus.
Dan konflik berbasis lingkungan yang meningkat juga secara drastis.
Semua ini akibat ulah manusia.
Namun, malapetaka ini dapat juga dicegah oleh manusia.
Karena itulah, ayo kita selamatkan Indonesia dari bumi panas.
Mari kita mulai mengurangi emisi gas rumah kaca Indonesia.
Ayo kita kurangi emisi gas rumah kaca 50% di tahun 2030.
Dan kita kurangi terus sampai akhirnya kita bisa mencapai nol emisi di tahun 2050.
Ayo hijaukan ekonomi kita, jaga hutan kita.
Jaga ekosistem laut kita.
Kembangkan energi bersih dan kurangi segala emisi karbon dalam kehidupan kita.
Sehingga Indonesia Emas 2045 akan hidup dalam bumi yang nyaman, sehat, dan bahagia.
Sehingga Indonesia dapat menjadi bagian penting dalam solusi global perubahan iklim.
Planet bumi harus kita sembuhkan dari sekarang.
Target besar dan mulia ini bisa kita capai.
Ayo kita bergotong royong.
Selamatkan planet bumi.
Selamatkan umat manusia.
Selamatkan generasi kita dan generasi seterusnya.
Kita sambut Indonesia Emas yang penuh harapan.
Selamatkan Indonesia 2045.
Sadarkah Anda, kita mungkin adalah generasi terakhir yang bisa hidup dalam dunia bercuaca normal. Kita juga adalah satu-satunya generasi yang bisa menyelamatkan umat manusia dari bahaya bumi mendidih yang menanti kita selamanya di depan. Ayo kita penuhi panggilan planet bumi, panggilan umat manusia, dan panggilan sejarah. Ayo sebarkan pesan ini dan tanda tangani petisi.